Welcome to this presentation from the Microsoft Virtual Academy. We'll be covering an overview of the Windows Server 2008 R2 Failover Clustering feature set. I'm Simon Perryman, a technical evangelist with Microsoft and a former program manager on the clustering and high availability team. Failover clustering was quite hard to use back in Server 2003. So since Server 2008 and onwards, a lot of the focus has been on simplicity and making the solution much easier to use, not only around deployment, but also management and virtual machine Hyper-V integration. In Windows Server 2008 R2, the primary focus was all around virtualization and providing a strong platform for Hyper-V to give it not only high availability, but VM mobility and flexibility of how you manage your data center, with a lot of great features such as live migration. Failover clustering has been an essential piece of the private cloud infrastructure. When you virtualize your VMs, it's great that you're able to consolidate and put them all onto a single server, but that server needs high availability because now you're putting more services on a single host, and losing that host could have a much greater impact. However, with clustering, and by connecting all of these servers together, when one host fails, the other servers can detect the failure, move the VMs back over to it, and then you can maintain high availability for your virtual machines or other clustered services and applications. Part 1 of this two-part session will cover the hardware and software requirements, as well as deployment considerations. Part 2 of this series will look at management, supportability, as well as cover some of the features specific to different highly available services and applications. Failover clustering in Windows Server 2008 R2 is an inbox feature. It's available in the Data Center and Enterprise editions, Itanium, as well as some of the other SKUs which are not part of Windows Server, such as Microsoft Hyper-V Server and Windows Storage Server. You'll notice that the one SKU that it is absent from is Windows Server Standard Edition, and this is because failover clustering is considered an enhanced feature, an add-on feature, so it is only available in the more upscale SKUs. The official name of the product is Windows Server Failover Clustering, or WSFC. This has actually changed since previous releases, where it used to be referred to as MSCS or Microsoft Cluster Service. Now this is important when you're looking at documentation because you want to ensure that you're looking at the right product, the 2008 and later product, since there was significant re-architecture in this version. So as you're looking through documentation, look for references for failover clustering, as references to MSCS or Microsoft Cluster Service will only be applicable to the Server 2003 versions and earlier. Pretty much all of the SKUs which support failover clustering support up to 16 nodes, the exception being Itanium Edition, which we generally see only used for SQL servers, and we don't tend to see much scale on that. The primary difference here is virtual machine licenses for the actual VM guests. Now this could be an important factor in your planning when you decide which version of Windows Server you should purchase. We're going to be covering Hyper-V Server in more details on the next slide, but it is a free SKU, and with that it means that it does not come with any licenses for the virtual machine guests themselves. Enterprise Edition, on the other hand, comes with 4 licenses for the virtual machine guests. This means that when you purchase one copy of Enterprise Edition, you get a license for the host, as well as 4 licenses for VM guests. Data Center, on the other hand, gives you an unlimited number of licenses for the VM guests. So you purchase one license for the Data Center Edition for the host, and then you get unlimited licenses for the VM guests. Now this could be an important deciding factor as you think about your enterprise's long-term virtualization goals. If you're only virtualizing a few servers, it could make sense to go with Enterprise Edition. However, if your enterprise plans to continue scaling out and plans to continue virtualizing all new services and applications, it may make sense to go with the Data Center Edition in the long run, since Data Center gives you a lot more flexibility with licensing, and you get an unlimited number of licenses for the virtual machine guests. Microsoft Hyper-V Server 2008 R2 is actually not branded Windows Server. The reason for this is that it does not contain many of the additional features and components which come with Windows Server, such as IIS or DHCP. The Hyper-V Server simply comes with the Hyper-V Server role and the failover clustering feature. But it is completely free. That's right, you can go online and you can download it today. Now, as we mentioned on the previous slide, this does not give you any licenses for the actual VMs themselves, which are running on top of the Hyper-V server. But nevertheless, this Hyper-V Server Edition has full cluster functionality, meaning that it supports 16 nodes, Hyper-V, failover clustering, and all the features that you want, such as cluster shared volumes and live migration. However, one of the trade-offs is that this version is built on Server Core. Now, if you're unfamiliar with Server Core, it is an installation option which you can select while deploying your Windows Server OS that basically allows you to install almost a bare operating system with no additional features, no graphical user interface, and because of this, it has a much smaller attack surface. If you're reducing the attack surface, and you're reducing the number of components on the server, that means that there are fewer items to patch and fewer security vulnerabilities. By reducing the number of maintenance operations that you have, you're actually going to increase the high availability of your server and your services because there will be fewer reboots that are needed because of these patches. Once again, the Hyper-V server is available as a free download today with full clustering support. So if you're new to the Microsoft virtualization stack, this is a great way to try it out, to feel it out, and to understand how the technology works without making a significant financial investment. Server Core, once again, gives you significantly higher availability. If you think about some of the added features which come with the full edition, you get Internet Explorer, Windows Media Player, sometimes the Office products, and these significantly open up the vulnerabilities. But with less patching, we maintain higher availability, and we can keep our services up and running for even longer. Now, since this is built on Core, it means that the command line is the primary scripting interface. Since there's no graphical user interface, some users can find this a challenge to manage if they're not familiar with the scripting languages. Server Core in 2008 R2 does support PowerShell, which is a great utility that you can use as a scripting tool. However, if you still want the full graphical user interface for failover cluster management, Hyper-V management, or server management, you can actually get this through remote management or through using remote server administration tools, known as RSAT. RSAT is also a free download and gives you the ability to manage specific servers, services, and features through a client machine. You simply go and download the package, and then you can connect remotely to the servers or applications and manage them even if they are running on a Server Core installation. As we continue to push high availability into the product, we wanted to not only do this in the software layer, but also the hardware layer, including networking and storage. When we look at our networking, we made it extremely flexible. So if you use IPv4 or IPv6, we support this, along with most 4 to 6 transition technologies. We support using DHCP or statically assigned IP addresses. The choice is yours. And since Windows Server 2008, we have supported having the nodes run on dissimilar subnets without having to stretch a VLAN between the nodes to create a common subnet. This gives you more flexibility with your deployment and really enhances the ability to have a disaster recovery solution or a multi-site cluster where you have your nodes in geographically separate locations. The number of networks used by the cluster have increased in this release, since we recommend having isolated networks specific for Hyper-V management, as well as live migration traffic. Nevertheless, all of these networks have built-in redundancy, meaning that if one of the networks fails, the cluster will continue to function. It will simply use another network. All of these networks are configurable by both priority and by function, so you can specify certain networks for live migration, for internal cluster communication, or for public access, depending on the latency and the bandwidth of these networks. NIC teaming is now supported on all cluster networks, so this can once again give you high availability with the loss of a network interface. With any type of high availability deployment, you want to try to eliminate all single points of failure, not just in the software layer, but throughout the hardware layer as well, and this would include your network interfaces. This would also include multipath I/O as a redundant connection to your storage area network. Failover clustering does require a SAN, or a storage area network, so that all of the nodes can access the data on the disk. The reason that we keep the application data on a shared disk is so that any node can access the data at any time. If all of the data was stored locally on a node, and that node became unavailable, none of the other nodes in the cluster would be able to access that application's data and start it up on another node. However, by requiring shared storage, and by us storing this application data in the shared storage, any node can start an application or service at any time, regardless of the availability of other nodes in the cluster. With the storage area network, clustering supports 3 shared bus types: Fiber Channel, iSCSI, and Serial Attached SCSI. Fiber Channel tends to be extremely fast, giving great performance to your storage fabric. However, it is often more expensive. On the other hand, Serial Attached SCSI is slightly less expensive, slightly less performant, so there's a balance. On the far side of that, you have iSCSI. iSCSI is extremely cheap. It communicates over Ethernet, and so you can even deploy an old server that you had as your iSCSI target, and this server can act as your storage area network. However, while iSCSI is cheap, it tends not to be as performant or as fast as either Fiber Channel or Serial Attached SCSI. So one of the considerations you need to keep in mind while planning your cluster deployment is what type of data is being accessed to the disk and how fast do you need access to that disk. One of the key requirements we have with shared storage is that it must support persistent reservations, which is a SCSI 3 command. Persistent reservations essentially allow one node to own a disk and to maintain that ownership and to not let any other nodes in the cluster steal that disk. It's essentially our way of enforcing a single disk owner. Now, most storage that's being deployed or that's being created since 2000 will support persistent reservations. So if you're purchasing a new storage array, generally this is not something that you need to worry about. Nevertheless, we do check for this as part of our support policy to ensure that the storage that you're using is supported in the cluster. Cluster support is very flexible. If you deploy clustering back in 2003 or earlier, you'd remember that there was a catalog which was required to have a solution which met the exact standards needed for support. This meant that you must use one of these solutions in the catalog, or Microsoft would not support your cluster. This could be challenging if you wanted to change hardware or upgrade it, since if that exact hardware change that you made does not map to something in the catalog, technically you would not be supported. We realized that this was quite a pain for not only our customers, but for product support, so in Windows Server 2008 and later, we have changed our support policy, and there are just 2 simple requirements needed for support. The first is that all components must have a logo for Windows Server 2008 or Windows Server 2008 R2. Having a logo is important because it means that the hardware has actually been tested and supported with clustering by the equipment manufacturer. The other requirement is that the complete solution must pass the cluster validation test. This is our best practice analyzer. One key thing to keep in mind with 2008 R2 is that we have not changed the support policy since 2008, which means that all of your hardware which you got validated on server 2008 will still work on 2008 R2, so there really is no reason not to upgrade to R2. And this includes the new clustered storage system, known as clustered shared volumes. CSV has the exact same requirements as traditional clustering, so if you ran and validated disks back in 2008, those will continue to work in 2008 R2. Let's talk more about deployment. Validating a cluster, as we mentioned, was one of the two requirements for having a supported cluster. This best practice analyzer will go and not only test the software stack, but also test all of the hardware components which are a part of this cluster deployment to ensure that they will function correctly. This test can be run before you even create the cluster, simply by specifying the nodes which will be potential members of the cluster. This test can be run during cluster deployment, and even after the cluster has been deployed, you can use this tool as a troubleshooting utility. So as soon as you run into a problem with your cluster, and something is not working appropriately, simply run cluster validation, and it will give you a good indication of where the problem is. If you're working with product support at Microsoft, this is now the first thing that they'll require you to do if you call them for help, because this will actually resolve many of the most common issues that the cluster team found with previous releases. This also has a great feature that inventories everything which has been deployed on the cluster. So if your cluster is already up and running and you have trouble with it, you can simply send the report to customer support and they will be able to just look at this report and understand the configuration, what is running on the cluster, how the dependencies are configured, and how all of these pieces interact. So there's no need to go and run additional tools or to describe your configuration. By simply sharing this report, it can be understood by product support. All of these reports are saved in a folder, and this folder is maintained and accessed on every node, and any type of action that you do on the cluster where you run a wizard, such as adding a new highly available resource, adding a new node to the cluster, changing the quorum type, all of these reports automatically get stored for you in this folder so that you can refer back to them at a later date. This means that, for example, if you're working in an area that has strict regulatory or compliance components, you could use this report to explain how your cluster's been deployed, and if there's a change which later impacts how the cluster functions, you can refer to these old reports to understand how it was deployed, and then you can figure out what has changed since then. Now let's take a look at cluster validation in our demo. Here I'm logged into a server, and I have not yet deployed my cluster. You can see the failover clustering feature can be added using the Add Feature wizard. I've already done this ahead of time. Now let's go and open up Failover Cluster Manager, which is our management utility for failover clustering. This is using an MMC 3.0 snap-in, so you may see the familiar interface of a left navigation pane, a central information pane, and a right-hand action pane. Here we are going to go and validate a configuration. It asks me to enter the name of the nodes which I want to use in this cluster. So I'm going to use 3 nodes. I have the option to run all of the tests, or only a subset of tests. In this case, for the sake of time and demo, I'm only going to run a subset of tests. Here you can see that there are quite a lot. We have tests that inventory the system, tests which ensure that the network is configured correctly and nodes can communicate properly, tests for our storage to ensure that every node can access every disk and that all of the disks support persistent reservations, and then tests about the system configuration, for example, ensuring that all of the nodes have the correct patches. Here I'll click Next, and we can see that a test has run, everything has passed, and if I click View Reports, I can go and see a report of the test that I just ran. Now, I actually ran validation against this cluster a little earlier, so I have a full report here that I can show you. Here you can see that it's flagging some items as warnings. Now, we offer 3 different settings here for the results. We have a green check mark, which means that everything passes and will function correctly. We have a yellow warning, which means that there could be trouble, but the cluster should still work normally. Nevertheless, if you want the highest availability possible, you should address this issue. And then we also have red X's, which indicate that there is an error, and which mean that the cluster will not be supported. So it is absolutely critical that you fix any errors, and it's definitely a best practice to take a look at any warnings. Now, let's take a look at the system configuration warning, for example. It jumps me down to the category, and then I can go and take a look at the update levels. And this simply tells me that all of the updates are consistent on 606, consistent on 607, yet 608 is missing a few patches. And so a best practice here would be for me to go and deploy these patches. And we're very clear by specifying the actual KB number that you need to go and deploy the patch, making it very easy to use. If we look at some of the networking examples, we can validate the IP address configuration, and we get another informational warning saying that I'm not using a best practice. So Validate is an excellent tool for not only cluster deployment, but also for cluster troubleshooting and ensuring that you are following best practices. Migration is another key component of cluster deployment. Migration is essentially the upgrade path which failover clustering has from Windows Server 2003, 2008, or even 2008 R2 if you want to do any type of consolidation project. The built-in migration wizard essentially will move a resource group from one cluster to another cluster. So to be very clear, it does not move clusters, but it moves groups between clusters. Now this utility supports all different types of networking configurations, even if they're dissimilar between the old cluster and the new cluster. And this means you can go from a static IP environment running IPv4 to a DHCP environment running IPv6 with no problem. All of the clustering groups do have a migration story as their upgrade path. Not all of them use the cluster migration wizard because some of them are out-of-box components which do require their own migration story, such as SQL Server and Exchange. When you go and run the migration, you not only get a pre-migration report which tells you the expected outcome, but you also get a post-migration report which details exactly what happened during the migration and if anything changed, such as if a group received a new DHCP address. Migration, however, does not copy storage data for you, and the reason for this is that we do not know if you plan to reuse your storage or to use brand new storage in the cluster. You can use both. If you want to use brand new storage, after you migrate the groups from the old cluster to the new cluster, you'll have to take the groups offline, copy the data over between the storage arrays, and then you can bring the groups back online on the new cluster. If you're reusing the same storage array, after you do the migration, you'll simply demask it from the old cluster and reattach it to the new cluster. And there will be some minimal downtime during this operation as well, since the highly available groups and applications cannot access the disk. Now let's jump back to our demo and actually see a cluster deployment happen. Here we're back to the Failover Cluster Manager, and creating a cluster is incredibly simple. We simply launch another wizard, it asks us for our nodes again. I'm going to specify my 3 nodes. I'm going to click Next. It tells me, hey, you didn't run all of the validation tests. Make sure that you run them all. Now, since I did this earlier, I actually know that I'm going to be okay, so I'm going to skip this warning. Finally, I'm asked for a name. What do I want to call my cluster? So I'm going to call this cluster Virtual Academy for the MVA. Oh, got to shrink this, so it will automatically shrink it for me. I click Finish, and it's going to go ahead and deploy this highly available clustered for me. Now, since I've already validated it, I know that everything's going to work correctly. And you'll see that this is an incredibly streamlined operation. I simply specified the nodes in my cluster, I confirmed my validation, and I gave it a name. And that's it. Those 3 simple steps will give you a highly available cluster. Now, if you did clustering back in the 2003 days or earlier, you'd remember that there were a lot more steps to this. You had to specify cluster disks, you had to assign IP addresses, you had to go and designate quorum settings, but we handle all of this for you using best practices. When we look at the quorum settings, we actually see whether there are any clustered disks and the number of nodes you have available to pick the optimal solution for you to give you the highest availability. And we detect clustered disks by simply looking at all of the nodes and seeing which disks can be accessed by every node, and we assume that those are going to be clustered disks. If we detect that you're using DHCP in your environment, we're actually going to go and just contact the DHCP server and get an unused IP address for you for the cluster network name. And once again, this is just to streamline and simplify the configuration. If you don't like these best practices which were picked for you, you could simply go and change the settings afterwards. But the whole goal here was just to get the cluster up and running as quickly and as simply as possible. I can now see that my cluster has been created. If I expanded services and applications, we can see that I have not deployed anything on top of the cluster yet. We'll be doing that in part 2 of the presentation. So I look at my nodes, I see my 3 cluster nodes, I look at my storage, and I can see these disks which were accessible by every node, so the cluster designated them as cluster storage, and I can look at my networks and see all of my cluster networks. As you can see, deploying a cluster simply takes a few minutes, and in part 2 we'll go and deploy some highly available services and applications on it. This wraps up the first part of this 2-part series on the Failover cluster feature overview. As we've shown you, deploying a cluster is now pretty easy. We have flexible software requirements, you can even use dissimilar hardware. You just have to follow the 2 requirements to have a supported cluster. Every component must be logoed for Windows Server 2008 or R2, and the entire solution must pass the validation test. But don't worry, if you're having any issues as you deploy your cluster, simply work with the validation tool as a great best practice analyzer to help you tinker with all of those different components to ensure that not only do you have a functional cluster, but that your cluster is using the best practices and best settings to give you the highest availability possible. And please check out some of these cluster resources. This video is part of the Microsoft Virtual Academy. Please make sure that you check out the other portions of this high availability track. Thank you.